It's now high summer. The fishing season on the rivers has just started. The weather's very hot, and as we go into July, my thoughts turn to roach fishing with hemp and tares, usually fishing with tares on the hook, feeding hemp. And it's a very, very good method. It's a comparatively cheap method. Hemp is cheap compared to maggots and casters. Maggots are over £3 a pint where I live. Casters are probably over £4 now. And hemp, even if you pay as much as £2 or £3 a kilo, that will cook up several pints of hemp seed when it's cooked. So it's still more like, I don't know, 60 or 80 pence a pint. And you don't even need that much for a good session fishing with hemp and tares, and you barely need an egg cup full of tares for hook bait. But I've been giving this method some thought. I love this method. You catch lots of decent roach, you get the odd big one. You tend to avoid the bleak and the minnows. Very rare to get either of those. Once in a while you do catch a bleak or a gudgeon on it, but by and large it's not too bad. The dace like tares and hemp, and on the lower stour they're very good at whipping the bait off the hook. And in the close season I've been reading a couple of books about the Thames. They're quite old books, and the main one, which you can't see very well here, which is How to Fish the Lower Thames by Frank Murgett, and this was written way back in 1960, so it's nearly as old as me. And Frank Murgett was a fairly well-known London angler who fished the Lower Thames, especially places like Teddington, Windsor, Kingston, and he really knew the Thames down there. He fished with Dave Stewart, who's still with us, another very fine roach angler, and he made some observations about hemp fishing, and it's the one that I'm coming to, in that with hemp and tares you catch a lot of what Frank called goers, which are fish around about this size, around about 7 or 8 inches, and the odd big one. And he observed that the biggest roach generally, and he was talking about 2-pounders on the Thames there, were often present in the swims, but the smaller fish got to the bait first, time and time again. And I'm wondering if this is what's happening to me on the stour. I am picking up the £1 plus roach now and again, not always. Sometimes I'm just getting fish to maybe 8 or 10 ounces, which is fine. But wouldn't it be nice to find those bigger ones, and maybe even a 2-pounder if I'm lucky, if I can find the right swims. And there's a couple of things going on here. One is that feeding hemp and fishing fairly fine and light shotting, the smaller fish are dashing around and they get into the bait first before the big ones, and the big ones are hanging back. They're behind the small fish, they're feeding off the bottom quite slowly and deliberately, but they're also being frightened by the action from the small fish. So every time you hook a smaller roach and it's flashing around the swim, possibly attracting pike into the swim, those bigger ones are becoming more wary and they do back off quite easily. To give a little example of big roach backing off, many years ago, in the days before I did a lot of hemp and tare fishing, I used to fish with casters quite a bit, and there was a junction on the Dorset Stour at Stour Pane which we can no longer fish. Apart from losing the fishing rights, it's totally grown in with blackthorn bushes. We used to have to cut through the blackthorn bushes every year just to get to the water's edge, and there was a sort of a slack there, and I discovered that you could go there and feed casters, and if you just fed every 20 minutes you could watch a shoal of good sized roach. These were from 12 ounces up to £1.50 pounds, and they would upend and they'd be feeding on those casters. So they're all heads down on the casters. And you would lay on with a couple of casters on an 18, and you could watch the roach take your bait, and you'd hook one, and the whole shoal would just vanish out of the swim. They wouldn't go very far. They just sort of back off quite quickly into the lily pads, and that was the time to feed. So having hooked the fish, played it and landed it, you'd feed straight away. One big handful of casters, not too tight, fairly spread out, because these fish needed room to feed on. And then after about 10 minutes they start drifting back, start feeding, and again after about 20 minutes you'd get another good roach. Off they'd go again, you'd feed, and that was the way it went. And those big roach were quite wary of the disturbance. So I'm thinking that catching 30 or 40 or 50 of these small roach is making the big ones wary, that want to feed, they're there, but maybe this isn't the way to get them. Now, Frank Murgett describes this same problem, and he said, observing that the biggest roach are coming to baits like bread crust, fished hard on the bottom, maybe with what they call the shot ledger. People call it the lift method now, but or possibly ledgered with a tiny little link ledger, or float ledgering again with a big shot and just letting it come there. Catching some on silkweed, fishing in the weirs, quite big fish that way. And funnily enough, another angler who was contemporary to him, a bloke called John Burrett, he wrote 2 books. One is Fishing Famous Rivers, Lower Thames, and the other one is Anglers' Angles, which he co-wrote with a guy called Alan Pearson. And these books also date back to the 1960s. And John Burrett describes fishing for hemp there, and instead of fishing with fairly light shotting down the line with hemp, he said the same thing. Above the bottom there are shoals and shoals and shoals of small roach that are madly feeding on the hemp. He didn't want those, he wanted the big ones that were sat at the bottom. So what he did was, first of all, he needed to get some hemp down on the bottom, and he actually mixed it in with breadcrumbs. A lot of hemp, not much breadcrumbs, so it went straight to the bottom and laid the hemp on the bottom. He then advocated fishing a fairly big porcupine quill. We don't have to use a porcupine quill, but with a coil of lead wire, which could be an olivette nowadays, that was set so it's just only off the bottom, and then about 2 foot of line below that. So his bait went straight down, just as it would with an olivette, and then he was fishing for those much better roach hard on the bottom and avoiding the small ones. He wasn't trying to catch 15 or 20 pounds of 3 or 4 ounce roach. He wanted those 1.5 pounds or even possibly a 2 pounder, a very good fish for the Thames, but in those days they certainly got caught, and they were certainly present. On a similar vein, many years ago I used to fish on a stretch of the Stour that's just about under control of Christchurch Angling Club at the moment, because it's potentially under house development, near Kinson, and there was a bit of bank there where you could sit on the bank, and I would feed 3 or 4 tares every 20 minutes. That doesn't sound much, no hemp at all, and I would set a stick float up so that it was about 2 foot over depth, very gentle current, just cast it downstream and just let that float settle with the bait on the bottom about where my feed was, and I'd lay the rod on the bank. So I'm sat on the high bank above the river, about 3 or 4 foot above the river, sat on my coat, something like that, and I just watched the float. It wasn't trotting, it was just holding there, so it's sort of laying on, keeping a low profile, keeping very quiet. And I picked up really, really good roach fishing like that. This is talking about 30 years ago. There were some very, very good roach in that stretch back then. There's still a few there, a lot more small ones than there were back then. And every so often I'd get this nice bite and hit a big roach. And I had roach to 2 pounds fishing like that. So I'm thinking maybe I need to find swims where I can try that same method out again of fishing a stick float and just getting it to hold. The current needs to be very gentle, needs a sort of clean gravel bottom. One of the reasons I didn't feed much into the river in those swims was that if I put much hemp in at all, and even the 3 or 4 tares was enough to bring them in, I started to hook barbel. And the problem was I was fishing in those days 1.1 pound bayer as a hook length and a fine wire 16. And you don't really want to be hooking what were 6 and 7, 8 pound barbel on that sort of gear. I did hook barbel, and usually what would happen is they didn't really know they were hooked. I just sort of play them very, very gently, and then after a little while they'd go, something's wrong here, and that would be a great big fast run straight through the weed bed and smash. Didn't happen too many times because, like I said, I was feeding very, very light, trying to avoid that happening. Hope I've given you some food for thought. I've given myself some food for thought. I need to try some different approaches this summer on the Stour. One other thing I may try is some hookable pellets. People have said to me about them before. I've currently got some Sonubate expander pellets that are very easy to prepare. You just soak them for a few hours. It says soak overnight, but I tried put them in when I got up in the morning and went fishing with them at 10 o'clock, and they were fine. So 3 or 4 hours is enough. You don't need very many, and maybe I'll feed ordinary feed pellets and see what happens with those as well. So until next time, tight lines, and I'll see you again soon.